Hello, friends. It's Chop. Here are Terrence and Tom from the Trillbillies discussing the floods that just happened in eastern Kentucky. Okay, so I know it may not seem like it in between my, jaunts in between New York and Los Angeles. I do sometimes notice what's going on in the rest of the country. And to that end, I would like to welcome on T&T of the T-Billies. That's right. It's Terrence and Tom from the Trillbillies to talk about the devastating floods that have just happened in their neck of the woods, eastern Kentucky. So, Terrence, you wrote about it in The Baffler. Tom, I read an interview with you by Sarah Miller about just like, your experience of the flood and just the history of eastern Kentucky. So, just to begin, guys, could you just share with me and our listeners what your experience or of you and your loved ones? What was your experience of the flood and its aftermath like?
Man, it was gnarly, dude. All the phone lines were down and I couldn't get a hold of anybody. Like I usually just when I get up in the morning, I call everybody, back home, and nobody was answering. Nothing was going on. So I was like, okay, well, maybe it's a little weird. And then I get a call from the Parkway Inn Motel, which is our hotel in Whitesburg, which ain't the Ivy Leagues if you ever want to stay in Whitesburg.
Most people, yeah, if you live in New York City, you go to brunch at A59, I don't know, some nice brunch spot. That's where me and Tom used to have to go to brunch on Sunday mornings with the church crowd to eat soggy biscuits and powder eggs.
So my sister calls me and she's rattled, and I'm like, what the fuck is going on? And she's like all of Whitesburg is underwater. I was waiting at the house, her and my nephew, to be rescued. And she's like, eventually it got so high, almost up to their roof, that we had to take our chances with the flood water. So they just jump in the fucking flood water, her and my nephew, and their dog. My nephew's got the dog underneath his arm. And then they float downstream, and she says it's not being in flood water is not like being in a lake or even a river or a swimming pool. It's it just takes you wherever the fuck it wants to,
And there's a ton of other shit in the water too,
and diseases,
and diseases, and all kinds of
gasoline.
Yeah. So my nephew, before she goes under this bridge, at the end of their holler, my nephew grabs her and pulls her up the hill, and they walk up the mountain and over the other side, which is an old railroad tracks, but it's all overgrown now. It's not in use anymore. And they have to walk down Kentucky 15 to the Parkway Inn, where they called me from a landline because all the cell phone lines were down. So the rest of the day, I'm just getting calls from buddies that I've not seen in a long time that don't live there anymore. Man, do you know, can you get a hold of anybody? My buddy Wes called, and he couldn't find his wife or kid for hours. And then eventually they ended up being fine. But so there was all that kind of stuff in the immediate. And then after the fact, a lot of people, including my mom, my sister, and my aunt, all lost everything. And it was wild. I don't know. It was, I'm still having a hard time wrapping my head around it, because a flood is, tornadoes, earthquakes, those things, you don't really think of floods in that calculus of varied, you see them on the news from time to time, but it's, I got a new appreciation.
Read your Bible, Tom. Floods are no joke.
It's actually the OG.
The Old Testament. Terrence, in your Baffler piece, you have there's a stunning thing you describe about seeing like a building structure that's just perfectly preserved, on top, just has been moved, and perfectly preserved, just placed on the precipice of a bridge or something, and then you realize you were trying to figure out, did the water suck it under the bridge, or did the waters just get so high that it went over the top of the bridge?
Yeah, it was hard for us to wrap our minds around because, as I pointed out, this housing structure, it had been upstream from this bridge, and it was like a mental block you have in your mind. How did it get from point A to point B? It just made no sense. And I think it's with floods, especially with this kind of flood. I mean, you think of, I guess, I don't know. I've never been in a serious flood before, especially not one in a city or in the countryside. But in this case, you had decades of strip mining. And I mean, we'll talk more about it in a second. But just to paint you a picture, in this case, you had decades of industrial activity that created this situation where the water was running through communities. Like I said in the piece, like stampedes of bulls. Like this isn't just rain accumulating in low-lying spots and then slowly rising, and then like you're like, oh shit, well, I guess the water's getting higher. No, this was like that scene in Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, where
yes, it's like wall of water, just like the deluge just pouring towards you.
Yeah. And you've got, I mean, the dispersal of debris is what's so astonishing, and not just debris, but also people. Like they actually 2 days ago had to raise the death toll again. Like they were still finding people that had been carried. We're talking miles. Like this one woman came into our mutual aid office and was telling us, she's like, yeah, I lost my car. She was like, I know that sounds maybe like cliche in a flood, but like, how do you lose a car? Like eventually you would imagine someone would find it. No one's found it 2 weeks later. Who the fuck knows? It's just I mean, we're
disappeared. It's just been it's just been erased by nature. But yeah, like you alluded to it, and I just wondering, like, could you talk a little bit about how they like sort of unique geography and history of Eastern Kentucky make it so uniquely vulnerable to like how devastating this flood was that like otherwise would have been bad, but not nearly as devastating as what we're seeing now?
So, I mean, surface mining is just about what it sounds like. Here, you've got a mountain, and it's got coal seams in it. And in a mountain, there's several coal seams. Once upon a time, you would go to the bottom of that mountain, you'd face it up, you'd send the coal miners in, they'd bring the coal out. But as the industry became more mechanized, and especially as it started to sort of enter its end game after all the easy-to-reach coal seams had been mined out, they started this new practice called mountaintop removal, which was a sort of even more developed form of just surface mining. And so you cut the top of the mountain off. I mean, you just dynamite it and then drag line it over into the streams. And then that way you can just literally lift the coal seams out of the earth that way. That creates flooding hazards in two ways. First of all, you've put in all that debris into the streams. The second way is that you've compacted the soil on top of the mountain so that none of it gets absorbed into a mountain. Like these hills around here are mostly porous, and there's also vegetation, and the water can get absorbed. I read this one article that said 70% of the rainwater went directly into the streams, which is apparently pretty astonishing. Like
we're talking like 11 inches in 12 hours.
Yeah, even more than that. In some cases, up to 16 or 17 inches. I mean, some of these houses I've been into, you look at the flood line, the water line in their house, and it's taller than you are.
Yeah, and 16 or 17 inches, like that's like if it was just flat or whatever. But 16 or 17 inches when it's now channeled into these very narrow creeks and valleys becomes like an astonishing amount of water in a really like frightening amount of time.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, and so the floods, it happened about 2 weeks ago. But what is like the state? What are the conditions in Eastern Kentucky and the flooded areas right now?
So a lot of those areas, obviously the water drained out. The water drained out within about 3 days. And there was a few dicey moments because it felt like it was going to start raining again at any moment. And it did start raining. And so there was a little bit of flooding again here and there. And obviously everything has come in waves. Every single day is different. Anybody who's like lived through a disaster like this, they're probably listening to this and like being, saying like, baby's first disaster or whatever. But
get your weight up, boys.
But it is my first disaster. I didn't know what to expect about anything like this. So like every day really is different. So like at first there was the National Guard, and you'd see those trucks everywhere. FEMA hadn't arrived yet. Nobody from the federal government, and we were just running supplies to people out of our own money and money that people could get to us. And then it sort of caught up about a week later. Then you had like an inundation of like crisis workers, like church groups, nonprofit people, and supplies. And then about a week after that, some point in the middle of all that, FEMA arrived, but you couldn't tell because, as I explained to Tom, like, when I was thinking of FEMA, I thought like, oh, like they'll have like cute, fancy uniforms. Like, I'm from the government. I'm here to help you. It's like, but no, they wear like polos and like boat shoes. They look like a CIA, like that CIA. They look kind of like that. That CIA agent in one of those James Bond movies. He's like supposed to be like the cool American with a Hawaiian shirt and like a
played by
like
Joe Don Baker in Goldeneye.
That's the exact one I'm thinking of. They look like Joe Don Baker.
What are you doing here, Wade?
Banyan trees. I am not here. The CIA has no knowledge, no involvement.
But Terrence, the title of your piece is "Flooding in the Sacrifice Zone," and I guess it makes a point of Eastern Kentucky. The conditions in Eastern Kentucky have been this is a sacrifice zone. Like this is a place that capitalism has taken untold wealth out of, but there is virtually no infrastructure that could contain something like this, and the effects of the flood were greatly magnified by the extraction of coal and mountaintop removal, like you were saying. So, I mean, how do you see this disaster as sort of New York has flooded a bunch of times, but as a preview of things to come as climate change worsens and as capitalism concentrates itself even further and just abandons larger and larger parts of this country to these sacrifice zones of people and just a forgotten about place.
I mean, Tom, I don't know if you want to add anything here, but I mean, I'll say that the inland southeast where we live is already mostly almost a rainforest. I mean, it gets something like 60 to 70 inches of rain a year. And by comparison, I'm originally from New Mexico, where we get about 6 or 7 inches of rain a year. I mean, we get a lot of rain here. And they're saying, and people were saying this for years. Tom sent me an article just about a week ago where we were talking about this, but people have been saying for years that Eastern Kentucky and Central Appalachia, this place where you've got this very specific mixture of circumstances, the legacy coal mining, but also increased rain events from climate change, from a warming world, are going to create this situation where these disasters are more common. So, I mean, they called this a 1 in 1,000 year flood, but I would assume over time that's going to be cut down to 1 in 10 years.
Well, yeah, it's accelerating at just kind of a crazy clip because that the article that Terrence was talking about is the study that the Army Corps of Engineers did with Duke University, and they looked at the river basins and all their tributaries in Central Appalachia where there's been a lot of strip mining going on, and they had projected that, and they showed the river basins that were the most affected, and the three that were most affected were the Lower Cumberland, the Big Sandy, and the Kentucky, which the headwaters of all three of those start in our town, and those were the most affected. And they projected that by the year 2070, that basically there would be this 35% increase in the stream levels and stuff because of the destruction from the coal mining and everything, added with a coming monsoon season for much of the southeast. So you got this thing that's ripe for disaster. Well, they're already at 35% in 2022. They projected that by 2070. So they're about 50 years early on their projections. And I think they ended that in 2015, the study.
I was just going to say, if you're a poor working person in one of these communities, you most likely live in a cheap trailer home in a floodplain. I mean, we've created virtual just traps. I mean, it's a death trap for a lot of people. And it probably varies from place to place, whether you're in Ohio or out west versus here. But here, a lot of the infrastructure is completely worn down and devastated by the coal industry. And that's what's kind of ironic about the whole idea of rebuilding. For years, for about 10 or 15 years, the sort of professional class here has been involved in this long-term project called, the just transition away from coal. And the whole insinuation was that we were rebuilding from the devastation of the coal industry, but nobody could say that because, we would be insulting the coal bosses. And so it's just devastation compounded on top of devastation.
So yeah, no, the Democratic governor Andy Bashir, Tom, you talked about something called the SOAR Initiative, saving our Appalachian rivers or something. What was it?
Shaping our Appalachian region.
Yeah.
Okay, shaping our. Gotta shape. Yeah, let's shape the region so it's a little less. I don't know. Cut through with deep creeks and cleared mountaintops.
Yeah. Yeah, so the SOAR
But, that initiative is dead now, basically.
Well, yeah, well, the whole thing was predicated on the idea of we're going to give these, it's everything we've ever heard about, sort of giving microloans to poor people to start businesses and all that kind of stuff. But it's a lot of people have been doing that for a while, right? As part of this whole calculus of the just transition movement, they called it in Eastern Kentucky and other places that are poor and affected by extractive industries and stuff. But it's the reason it's dead is okay, if me and you have a restaurant wheel in this town that's become rapidly depopulated because all the jobs are going out, right? And a flood comes and takes our building out. That's almost like a mercy kill in a way, right? Because it's now I get my insurance money and all this stuff, and I don't have to live on these razor ass thin margins. I
don't have to set it on fire myself and hope I did a good job.
right. Yeah, we don't have to Goodfellas it. So, yeah, but the whole thing is a crock, and then it's I'd mentioned to Sarah in that thing that some of the things they had come up with were Elizabeth Holmes Theranos-esque horseshit, where they wanted to take mine runoff water that was trapped in what they call slurry ponds, and these things when they rupture can be pretty destructive. I mean, they've wiped out towns and everything like that. One in Martin County, Kentucky, was what was it, Terrence? 3 times the size of the Exxon Valdez oil spill when it ruptured and just buried the town and this mine runoff shit. But this guy wanted to take all the coal slurry and use it to generate nuclear power as a clean energy thing. And it's
how does that work?
Man, well, you'll hear Japan does that, but they have the whole Pacific to draw water from and whatnot. Yeah, there was a lot of holes in it, but it's that kind of stuff. It's all scammy shit. And then the other thing is, they let all these recycled coal bosses get in on the ground floor of whatever the newest thing is, whether it's solar or whatever it is. So you have all these old guys that were coal diehards that are now oh, we're solar guys, but really all they've done is just retrofitted their outfits to put up solar panels.
Well, we will still be using coal to run the solar panels.
right.
I know you guys have mentioned some of the mutual aid work you're doing, just out of pocket on your own. But Terrence, a point you raise in your Baffler piece is sort of the limits of charity when confronted with what is it, a generational environmental and economic problems that are now coming to the fore because of things like flooding and climate change. But just you make the point that people need socks or generators or whatever, but as soon as you start talking about, hey, how we just give them housing or a new place to live, the steel door just slams shut.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this is an interesting issue with this that I've really been turning over in my mind a lot, which is that natural disasters, and again, that phrase I find to be very interesting that we call them natural disasters. But natural disasters do kind of create a contradiction, which is that by their very nature, by their very physical force, they can sort of challenge in a revolutionary way, an accelerationist way. It's not good, but they challenge the bounds of property. They turn private property and personal property into public property. All your shit goes into the creek.
A lake, into a fucking swamp.
Yeah. The lady's car.
Hey, the property line's by the poplar.
Take the breeze. My stinger is ready. The battle approaches.